But this ethical dualism, which it does not regulate, it affects both those who are fighting directly and those who are fighting remotely. It strikes such a way that this one is from collective cultural self-defense, this one is from the war. Good, yes, it's good. He has so dared this very layer of rationality, even the rationality of the Cold War rationality, or any other rationality from the elites of the countries involved, that there is no certainty, that it will not guide them in the future. In the sense that, for example, in order to maintain in Russia, we have a rather weak ideological fire, as you have noticed. It consists of quite complex pieces of ideology and worldviews interacting with each other. Here, but even here, it is required to strengthen the rhetoric of the possibility of nuclear war. There is such rhetoric, there is also in the world, and I'm not at all sure what that is. We don't even understand from what rationality these conflicts begin. For example, we don't understand much, well, and how it will continue, we do not understand either. I get it. The fear of nuclear war is normal and rational. I understand where your classical theory comes from. Well, the whole theory of international relations in the Cold War was mainly formed around the notorious nuclear deterrence. I admit, I am much more calm. Maybe generationally, by the way, the difference is in experience. I didn't live here during the fear of the Cold War. So, well, the fear of nuclear war, so the attitude towards it is a little different. Well, let's say I say it bluntly, precisely because it's so emotional in scale. In other words, I still believe that the mass use of nuclear weapons is an instrument of deterrence. That is why it will not be massively applied. Do I admit, for example, the possibility of local use of a tactical nuclear charge? Yes, I admit it. It's during this period of chaos. Will it have disastrous consequences for humanity? Honestly, no, I don't think so. Unfortunately, there is even an example literally with this month. We know that the equivalent of 2 nuclear bombs were dropped on the Gaza Strip. Well, as you can see, the world continued to exist. The world continued to move forward, as it were. Therefore, this is exactly where you can connect mine. I am connecting my rationality here, and I think that it is quite possible that it will be detabooed. But the instinct of self-preservation is a reliable thing, and it will not come to a full-scale zero-sum conflict at the nuclear level. At the same time, it is possible that the threat of the real use of tactical nuclear charges will lead the parties, among other things, to greater responsibility. Right there, here's a very interesting point. We haven't discussed it, but it's connected. The system, when the war is removed from the bracket, actually makes the parties more irresponsible. If we talk in terms of criminology, which you sometimes also use in your braid, you are no longer responsible for the bazaar. That is, as if especially sorry, small countries. In other words, it is necessary to understand that a small country often believes in such conditions that it can, well, behaves much more aggressively, let's say, than it would behave, knowing that something might fly over it. Well, this is again because of the observations of the last, such a long distance. But coming back to the ethical sense, I would still argue a little bit here for the sake of accuracy about the terms. In my opinion, the problem is not a collective ethical sense. The problem is the collective emotion. Collective emotion is the problem. But it's just that in the system that I am now offering in lectures and to listeners, I share a collective one, a collective desire for immortality and so on, and the collective pathos, which is purely grassroots. Most often it is a grassroots emotion, directed there either, well, sorry, greed, lust, and there are literally 3 nominations. That's how the reptilian brain works. And just in my opinion, this key problem lies in the fact that it is very ironic that since the 70s, there has been a constant surge of emotions in politics. If you compare the language in which politicians within countries and among themselves communicated in the 70s, and even in the 80s, with the way they communicate now, then I'm sorry, there is Plato's Greek Academy on the one hand, and today there is a yard bazaar, and a yard squalor there, I do not know, grandmothers. That's how much it's changed. And this is exactly what it requires from its own separate comprehension. In my opinion, the reason is that it was after the Second World War that both the West and the Soviet Union, collectively, chose a bet on a consumer society, which by its nature is based on emotional manipulation. Unfortunately, this is also connected with the gradual spread of mass suffrage. In other words, we see a very clear pattern. With the expansion of the right to vote, you have more and more emotionalization of politics. And if initially, it can be assumed that politicians tried to use emotion as a rational tool, well, that is, they used emotion for conscious manipulation, in accordance with one or another political goal. Then as the ecology changed, and the politicians themselves quietly emigrated under these emotions themselves, and began to move emotionally and justify their decisions. In other words, they began to justify decisions through emotional manipulation. Mind you, it's not even through an ethical way, not through an ethical act, but through emotional manipulation. Social media technology has reinforced this trend. That is, relatively speaking, politicians are now collecting likes. And this, in my opinion, is a much greater threat, because they collect likes during the war. And here we can see it very well. Fashionable, not fashionable. There is hypovo, not hypovo. This has all become part of this military reality. And that's exactly what, in my opinion, is a huge threat. The war, this space is precisely ethical, I would say irrational. But space and pathos emotions are there, I do not know, art after the war. Understanding the experience of the war. There are lyrical works there, well, that's the rest. But when it becomes a mobilization tool for you, then here we generally see a very strange phenomenon that we have not yet comprehended much. This is the kind of work I share with you, the accumulated experience of what I do. Reliance on emotion in modern warfare leads to the collapse of cause and effect relationships. Perception of cause and effect relationships, once, and to the collapse, so far as a metaphor, of nerve endings. In other words, society becomes insensitive to pain. And there is a very paradoxical situation of invisible visibility. That is, relatively speaking, if you remembered about it, you had the Afghan War, and I can give an example from Vietnam. These coffins with flags came, but they were not in sight. They were more or less embarrassed. They tried to put them out of brackets. In the modern reality of emotional sublimation, as the main tool of mobilization, all flags are in sight, hectares of cemeteries, and the population is not heard. And this is a very big danger. That is, correcting your thesis threat is not all of it. A threat to pathos. The threat in the pathos of modern war. That's the threat. Me? Yes. There, apparently, I generally agree that this is exactly an emotion. This is exactly what it is, where we have rather a problem of possible escalation, emotional sublimation. And I don't understand yet what kind of rationality could have stopped it, even after 30 years. Why? And I will answer. I'm well, the hypothesis is accurate enough. It is through this bundle. It's with logos. That is, it's from irrationality. Through because logos alone will not stop it. That is, the rationality of the goal alone cannot stop it, because man does not live by bread alone. Because there are values for which people are willing to die and kill. This is it. Rationality breaks down on this. That there are values that are of utmost importance to people. There's language, culture, faith, and so on and so forth. Ideology as a simulator of faith, however. And this is what, in my opinion, the whole Westphalian model burned. In other words, she tried to build it on pure rationality, and so she lost strategically. At the new stage, I hope, there will be a return of the ethos to its deserved primary place. And after this return, including the possibility of a war for it, there will be a creation so that this war is not primarily self-destructive for us, but is more self-purifying, then rationality is connected. That is, if conditionally now, we have had dominance over a long distance of this one. That is, let's do this. I understand, probably, what the difficulty of communication is. Let's say so. This is an emotion of a very high order. This is an emotion, as there is no more love for that one who will lay down his soul for others, its own. As if you can say that this is an emotion, but, in my opinion, it is not an emotion. We can argue in terms of terminology, and there is an emotion of this level of consumer society. That is, I can say it rudely, but I won't. That is here. But the difference between them is clear. The problem is that a high-order emotion is now replaced by a low-order emotion. Accordingly, you need to deploy. Yeah. Amazing eyes. I am now and at first on understanding really what looks like this, from where I initially had a mix in our conversation. What looks like an ethos, not evil, is an ethical fixation. That's not it. This is a binary structures of military ideologies. This is not it in the sense that I will die for my friends. This is the primary emotion of the war itself, for which it is important to know who we are and who they are. And it is not important to know what you are dying for. Yes. And this, I thought it was such an extreme degenerate part of the ethical, but I also agree that it can be defined as a military emotion. And I will add to you here, in fact, if you look at real experience, what is the tragedy there? If you seriously communicate with frontline soldiers from both sides, I am lucky by God's grace, I have experience with both. They have everything, they're much healthier. They are fighting there on an ethical basis, for the most part, in fact. This psychotization is happening in society, in the rear. Psychotization takes place in the rear, and this is also a goal, because, unfortunately, in my opinion, well, just in the 70s, the development of a new type of war begins, the conscious goal of which is driving your opponent's rear crazy, not winning at the front, because, well, because from the point of view, again, read this essay about Leviathan. For Leviathan, this is more rational. You see, it's more rational for Leviathan to drive the enemy's rear crazy than to defeat him on the battlefield. Do you understand what else is the problem?
Это потрясающий тезис, на мой взгляд, потому что из этого следует, что такая рациональная
Game war by controlling
попытка вести
emotions.
войну
Since you
посредством
can't control
контроля
it, it's
эмоций,
like big
это
millennials.
ты не можешь контролировать. Это как бы большие тысячелетние традиции. Да,
Yes, and
но
you,
ты можешь
but you can control it
локально это
locally. Then
контролировать,
you
ты
can
можешь
even
даже
initiate a war.
инициировать
Then you
войну,
can
ты
even
можешь
start a
даже
war from
на
scratch
пустом
if you
месте
try
начать
very
войну, если
hard,
ты очень
but,
постараешься.
not so quickly finish, but.
Но не так быстро закончить.
Well, either, or for business interest, let's get straight. Or, you can use the war as an argument for business interest, that is, a colonial type war. I need to squeeze out this mine. I will start with it, I will enter. Only if you used to do it directly, that is, relatively speaking, well, it did not occur to the British colonizers of India, or the Portuguese of Africa, to give a very complex Manichaean justification for why they do it. Just because we need it. We came and took it, and in this sense, it may sound wild for a modern person, but if you think about it, a much more honest approach. That does not require you to be ethical. It does not require manipulation from you. And now he demands it. And now you need to justify any action with ethical manipulation. That's the tragedy. And this means the following. These sublimations, these fires, based on a combination of rationalism with emotional dispersal. Such manipulation of rational emotional sublimation, it is not rational in the sense that it will not allow stopping this type of war, which without turning to, ethical in the sense of even religious, yes, not consumer wedge, well, as to the deeper models of man, it can't stop.
не потребительской, к подлинным, к более глубоким моделям человека, это не может остановиться.
Well, yes, and unfortunately, what is my prognosis here? In other words, this is a metaphor for a forest fire. Unfortunately, a lot has been built up, and it will burn out. That is here, well, we have decades ahead of us, when we will see this model, how it will in fact burn out. How gradual? Well, gradually based on its results. I hope that a very big price will be paid for it, but the generation of politicians who are used to acting like this and think in this preontology will be replaced by other politicians, just by virtue of a certain thing in those societies that will survive. Let's be blunt, in those societies that will survive. Not everyone will survive, but in those societies that survive, there will be a gradual change of this generational paradigm, attitude to reality, including the reality of war, and already after this shift. Why am I talking about the 30 years war? That is, it is a very long process. These people will be able to develop new, more understandable, and in my opinion, more hypocritical rules. In other words, I am an optimist strategically, but tactically, unfortunately, I can't console you with anything.